Hi, this is Christina Corcoran from Energy State of Mind, and I've got my friend and co-host Param Kumar on the phone with me, and Jack Doueck. You'll know a lot of people know Jack from the energy marketing conferences, as well as a lot of his other businesses, but you may not know that he is a published author, and he's been a published author for the past 2 decades. So, Jack, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, you're welcome. So, as I just mentioned, you've been a published author for 2 decades now, and you had two other books that focused on motivating people and doing acts of kindness. The first one, way back in 1998, with the Hest Boomerang and how acts of kindness enrich your life. And then another one in 2002, the title was Joseph, How One Man Can Make a Difference. And both of these books were really inspirational books that did really well. So now, almost 20 years later, what inspired you to write this book, The 6 Steps of Overcoming Adversity?
Well, thanks. Thanks. Good question. It's a very good question. My feeling is that millions of people today are suffering, whether it's from COVID-19 physically, whether it's unemployment. Millions and millions of people have been out of work over the last 6 or 9 months. There's tremendous stress going on. I've been teaching this 6 step program for more than a decade now, mostly in colleges, but also community centers and in other places. And I knew the timing was right now to be able to reach a larger audience with this program because I know it works and I really wanted people to be able to take advantage of it.
Didn't realize you were teaching it as well. That's
Yep.
awesome.
Perhaps you could tell us some more about how different people have used the 6 step program in order to overcome their adversity, whether it be, was it mostly companies, professionals in their work life, or also in their personal lives?
Great question, Kumar. So, the way I look at it, I think human beings have 5 dimensions of their lives. Number one, their physical dimension, their body. Number two, the bodies, I should say. Number two, their financial dimension. If they have a job, if they're able to feed their family, if they have a roof over their heads, if they're making money, if on a larger scale, if they have investments. So that's the financial dimension. The third dimension of their life is their intellectual or mental dimension of their life. Then their spiritual dimension, and then their emotional dimension. So in all 5 of the dimensions, physically, financially, spiritually, going to that, your conscience, your soul, mentally, your mind, your intellect, and emotionally, your heart, relationships. In all 5 of these dimensions, people have issues. They have disappointments, they have grief, they have loss, they have sadness. And I believe that these 5 dimensions, that you could apply these 6 steps to any of the 6 dimensions, 5 dimensions of your life, the 6 steps to the 5 dimensions. And I want to say that what happens in one area of your life connects to all the others. So for example, for more than 20 years, I sat on the board of a few nonprofits. One nonprofit, what we did was we find people jobs, free to the employer, free to the employees, for people that looking for jobs. And what I find by interviewing hundreds and hundreds of people that just lost their jobs is that they're suffering from a financial problem, right? Not having money coming in, but
Right.
that affects every other aspect of their lives, and it creates a vicious cycle. So, for example, you lose your job. Are you the first person in the gym the next day? I don't think so, right? Are you the next person that's going to go to church the next day or to a synagogue and to volunteer your time? Probably not. You don't feel good. You don't feel good about yourself. Does it affect your emotional dimension with your wife, with your spouse, with your family, with your kids? You can't give them allowance. It really affects everything. I myself have witnessed dozens and dozens of business people who lost their businesses. And they can't even read the help wanted section online. They can't even look. So you have to kind of help them get their act together, help them go, because every one of their 5 dimensions is interconnected and the vicious cycles continue. So my goal is to be able to take a vicious cycle and turn it into a virtuous cycle and be able to break out of these vicious cycles and help people in any one of the dimensions. So to answer your question more clearly, Kumar, it's primarily for business people, but it really could apply and does apply to personal as well.
If I may, there is, I don't know if you have watched the famous commencement address by Steve Jobs at Harvard University, because he talks about that exact point in terms of how do you deal with getting fired from a company that you founded. I mean, it is devastating on so many different levels. Yeah. And so if you've had an emotional attachment to your work, if you've been so passionate about it, it hurts very much. Yeah. The reasons don't matter.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it does. And that interferes with everything. Your ability to interact with your family, your friends, you're reaching out to coworkers because you're embarrassed. So, yeah.
It's exactly right. There's a lot of shame. When I was a kid, my father was fired and he didn't let my mother know about it until the actual day that he didn't go to work. So he got 2 or 3 or 4 weeks notice, but then he wouldn't kind of face into it. He was kind of in denial. And then all of a sudden my mother turns to my father one day and says, "How come you're not going to work?" He says, "Well, 3, 4 weeks ago, I got laid off because there's a little bit of a downturn." And he was just so embarrassed. And and as a little boy at the time, I had the feeling, I kind of felt his sadness and his embarrassment and his shame. He had nothing to be embarrassed about. Millions of people that were let off at the time, but he didn't feel that way. He felt it was a personal loss and a personal, he was disappointing his wife and his family. And so I know what it feels like to be in that position, and I've lived in it in my life. And that's why I spent the next X number of years, more than 25 years volunteering and helping people find jobs. So I really felt the pain of that.
That's awesome. I mean, very commendable to do that. And
Thank you.
I mean, basically you were probably teaching yourself the 6 steps without even realizing it's real life.
Right.
I mean, that is the best way to learn, right?
Yeah.
Live it.
So in your book, you talk about inflection points. Can you expand on what they are and, what do they have to do with the 6-step program?
Well, that's a great question. So what I do with kids, is I put up a chart like this on the wall where you can see, like, this could be the success of a marriage, of an organization, of a team. It could be the success of a business, of course. And if you notice the business starts off good and then it has a fall. This fall here is the first inflection point right there. Okay. And what they do at that inflection point will decide whether they're going to survive and go back up, or they're going to go down and go out of business. And that works for professionally, it works with teams. I coach basketball for a dozen years, and it works the same way. You have a devastating loss, a disappointment. And what do you do when that happens? So in my book, I talk a lot about companies on both sides of the spectrum. Companies like Radio Shack that had the inflection point, or Toys R Us, and kind of not being able to follow these and disappearing. And then you have companies that have hit those inflection points. Companies like Walmart, companies like Coca-Cola, companies like Lexus, Toyota, and what they did when they suffered their loss, when they suffered their disappointments, what they did turned the negative into a positive. Believe it or not, you can take every negative that happens and literally turn it into a positive. And that's what this is all about.
Yeah, you were telling me about the Coca-Cola story.
Right.
With when they came out with the new Coke.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Coca-Cola came out with this new product, new Coke. I mean, the reason they came out with it made a lot of sense, right? They were losing a lot of market share to Pepsi. Pepsi had Michael Jackson, remember him? He was doing all these fancy, funny footwear commercials about the new generation. And Pepsi was the new generation, and Coke was this old, farty, fluddy-duddy company. So you don't want to go with Coke, you want to go with Pepsi. So Coke came out with new Coke, and we're going to compete with Pepsi. We're going to be just like Pepsi. We're going to be new and different and young for the young generation. And it was a flop. It was just a flop. And how they dealt with that crisis almost put them out of business. they actually got rid of the regular Coca-Cola formula, and the new Coke people just didn't like the taste. So how they dealt with that was exactly the model for how every business should deal with their inflection points. You know, facing right into the problem, going to the customer and taking all the product back that they didn't like, taking what they do well, and what they did well was they had Coca-Cola. People loved Coca-Cola, so they created a new image called Coca-Cola Classic, and they sent all free goods out all over to all the bottlers, and they got everybody excited about it, and it just turned the whole company around. In fact, when Coca-Cola Classic came out, and they took back a tremendous market share from Pepsi because of how they followed these steps, people actually accused Coke of fraud. They actually said, "Oh, you did that new Coke so you can go do this whole thing and get market share." When Coca-Cola Classic came back out, they literally stopped regular TV programming to announce it. That's how big it was. It was kind of amazing. And they just took back their market share. The same exact story happened, a little slightly different, but with the Lexus, which when you read I don't want to give it away now. When you read my book, you'll see what they did to turn themselves into a car that actually created market share for themselves and beat their competitors like BMW and Mercedes-Benz because they had a problem. So it's kind of how they dealt with their problem, turned their company into a success.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there are lots and lots of examples of those inflection points. Instead of turning one step forward, two steps back, it basically is one step forward, maybe 3/4 of a step back, but that's okay.
Right.
So long as you can keep that again, the momentum, probably going to be all right.
Exactly.